Friends, good evening. Oh, well, come on. Good evening. I really am pleasantly surprised. Maybe I should not be, but I was thinking that because this is online, there'd be fewer people in church, but this makes my heart so warm and wonderful to see you. I'm delighted to see every one of you in church and those online. Welcome to this Lenten series, 6-week Lenten series on Francis of Assisi. We have named it the man, the saint, the legend, because the boundaries between these three things is fluid, and so we need to uncover all of that. You might ask me, why Francis of Assisi? This is the fourth in the series of these reflections that I have done. I began with John of the Cross, and that was when COVID had hit us really bad. There was nobody in church, and we did this online, and it was very well accepted, and more than anything else, it's transformed me. A lot of people say, Jesus changed my life. And that is true in my case too. I'm a priest for Christ, but John of the Cross changed my life. And so then I began to discover these saints, rediscover these saints more. And then I did Therese of Lisieux, because John of the Cross was so high for some people. I wanted to give something very simple. And we gave the spirituality of Therese of Lisieux. And then I moved to some contemporary figures with some professors from the University of Dayton on Dorothy Day, Archbishop Romero, Thomas Merton, Thea Bowman. That was the fall series last year. And all of them were very well received. Now, I decided to go with somebody who has contemporary currency, but was a product of the medieval times. So this is the 1200s. And this man has such currency and relevance even today that nobody who reflects on this man could not gain something for themselves. Now, this is true of all saints. However, it's not just in the Catholic circle that Francis of Assisi has relevance. 20 years back, the October 15th, 1992, Time magazine, this is when the millennium is coming to a close, and they're looking at personalities who may have influenced the last 1,000 years. There were 20 figures from the 1,000 years that Time magazine said are the people who had tremendous influence in that millennium. And Francis of Assisi was one of them. Francis is invoked by everybody. Environmentalists, whether they are Christian or not, gardeners, you probably have a statue in your yard, many Catholics do. Peace activists, there is a very valid reason for this, although we'll try to understand his influence on making peace in the medieval times. Animal enthusiasts, of course, October 4th, the one activity that most parishes have is the blessing of pets, and practically by everyone. Francis of Assisi is everybody's saint. And everybody has their own understanding of his spirituality. Now, the reason I chose Francis of Assisi, besides the fact that he has tremendous contemporary relevance, is because Francis has much to offer to the contemporary church and the world. His relevance is going to is in many ways permanent, but in these times, as we go through whatever we are going through in the church, particularly this division in the church, right and left, traditionalists and progressives, Francis of Assisi offers something for everybody. So, because he lived in one of those times where there was tremendous crisis in the church. So why Francis of Assisi, besides the fact that he has contemporary relevance, is also because these are people in whom I have developed some interest. John of the Cross, Teresa of Lisieux, Archbishop Oscar Romero, and Francis of Assisi. They are doing something to me. Even though I am approaching Francis of Assisi from the outside, I'm not a Franciscan. And perhaps a Franciscan will find that my interpretation is very subjective. But these people are doing something to me. They're transforming me. So my interest in Francis of Assisi, besides the historical and contemporary context, is what these saints are doing to me. But as I said, I'm not a Franciscan, and my priestly formation is not in the Franciscan order. So my reflection is from the outside, and so it may have its limitations, yet I have done much research to understand him in the way that not only makes sense to me, but provides us relevance in the Catholic community. Now, he's one of those saints with whom getting past the legends and the myths are going to be difficult, right? A lot of things have been attributed to Francis of Assisi. Now, this is true with all the lives of the saints. When I first joined the Redemptorist order back in India, the first things that were given to us were the lives of saints. And I found it so difficult to connect with them because in the way in which these lives were written, sometimes almost seemed unreal, perhaps a little romanticized. Now, nothing could be more true than with Francis of Assisi. Call them legends, call them myths, call them stories. In the medieval times, though, this was not an attempt to deceive people, to mislead people. In the medieval times, these stories that got told in ways that, exaggerated the values of, it was an act of homage to these saints. It was an expression of medieval piety. As I said, this is more true in the case of Francis of Assisi, and in this series, we will try to discover the man behind the myths and the legends. And I'm going to say this to you. If you haven't done that kind of reading, there's a very strong chance that you're going to be very disappointed with the kind of Francis that emerges, the Francis of history. I'm not saying that makes him any less relevant. But our common understanding of him being this darling saint of everybody, perhaps a tree-hugging saint, and who preached to the birds and the wolf of Gubbio, or wrote the hymn, "Make me a channel of your peace." By the way, that goes back to 1912, that hymn. It's not the product of Francis of Assisi's own writing. And it's an anonymous work. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with Francis of Assisi. It's based on his sentiments, his spirituality, but it's a much later work than Francis of Assisi. There are sayings that are attributed to him, like preach and use words when it is necessary. Surely not the words of Francis of Assisi. However, when you look at his life, that's pretty true. But it's not his work. He was not the saint of animals in the same way that we have gotten used to thinking of him. His famous poem, The Canticle of the Sun, it's really not written as a work of environmental concern. In medieval times, it wasn't the concern. The real motivation behind the Canticle of the Sun is the passion of Jesus Christ. And that's why I'm saying that some of these things, as it emerges, you will find it really intriguing, and perhaps it will strip away some of the myths and the legends that we have come to recognize in Francis of Assisi. And so if your image of Francis of Assisi is Franco Zeffirelli's movie, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, and if you don't want that to be destroyed, stop following this series. Because you're going to be, this is not Hollywood romanticization of Francis of Assisi. Francis of history and the Francis of Hollywood, sometimes based on events, but yet, you know, Franco Zeffirelli's movie. That's Hollywood. For many folks, Francis of Assisi is a very gentle, non-threatening of the Catholic saints. And as we discover him more, while this might be true, there are events in his life where we see a more forceful Francis, a Francis that we might not be used to. But we will do that, we'll keep that for the later sessions. Now, as far as the sources are concerned, this is just an introductory stuff I need to deal with so that you have an understanding of where I'm coming from. As far as the sources are concerned, I'm relying myself on 4 sources, and I have deliberately chosen these sources as people who are trying to discover the real Francis of Assisi and separating themselves from the myths and the legends. So, the very first work, and this is the work that I did not refer to, but the very first biography of Francis of Assisi is by Thomas of Salerno, and it is written pretty much after the death of Francis. Thomas of Salerno was a Franciscan, and he was around Francis's age, and he joined the Franciscan order in 1215, or shortly after its founding. And Thomas was asked by Pope Gregory IX to write a biography of Francis because he was known as a saint even before he died. People were looking for relics. I mean, they had to protect every bit of him, his clothing, so that people just would not, you know, take stuff and run away with it. So he was a saint even before he died, and he kind of had an awareness of it. So he was canonized in 1228, and the biography was supposed to give us a good insight into who Francis was. However, Thomas of Salerno's interpretation of Francis was problematic, and so this biography, Thomas himself then rewrites it. And I'll give you an example of that. For example, his interpretation of, or his portrayal of Francis's parents is very negative. And history tells us that probably is not the case. Not probably, that is not the case. So Thomas himself goes and reviews some of, so that's not the kind of research I entered into. You know, I did not have the time to look at his original biography and then give another look at the second review. Just did not have the time. However, we have some very, very good sources who have gleaned all this information and are able to separate the wrong interpretation of Francis's history and his life and give us true material. And if you want, I'm going to propose 2 books to you, and if you want to get into a more dense book, this is the best source you have, and this book and its name is in the information that I'm going to send to you after this session is over, right? It'll come to you via email. And it's Raul Mancelli's St. Francis of Assisi. It's one of the best works that I have read about him. Now, if you want something lighter, and yet it's based on facts and history, this is somebody from Hollywood, but his name is Jared Thomas Straub, and I read this first a few years ago. By the way, I can give you all this information later, but it's called The Loneliness of Longing of St. Francis of Assisi. Now, Jared Thomas Straub is an executive producer of many of the television series. For example, is it Grey's Anatomy, or is it The Doctors, or the hospital, the General Hospital, right? He is involved in the production of, and he was an atheist. But he's sitting in the chapel in Assisi, and he has a deep conversion experience. And then he writes this beautiful book about him. It's called The Loneliness and Longing of St. Francis. Gerard Thomas Strock. It makes for lighter reading. If you want to enter into the depths of Francis in some historically solid, but even in some dense way, Raoul Mancelli's book, Francis of Assisi, is an excellent source. There are two other books that I'm relying on. It's Francis of Assisi by Augustine Thompson, OP, not a Franciscan, so he's writing from the outside. And some of the Franciscans took issues with his interpretation of, but he bases himself very much on Thomas of Celano's book, on Raoul Mancelli's book. So it's called Francis of Assisi, A New Biography, and it's by Augustine Thompson. He's a religious a Dominican. And then you have Lawrence Cunningham. Again, lighter reading, but tries to be very careful about separating myths and legends and history. So these are the four books that I'm relying on, and these are my sources. These more historical writings reveal a Francis who's different from that person that we have come to imagine. We will discover a very complex and a conflicted person. And this is sometimes difficult to digest about Francis. When you think about, or for that matter, any saint, when you think about saints, we think of them as people in neat packages. Well, certainly Francis was not. He's very conflicted. You will notice there were times that his in the way he acted was sometimes inconsistent with what you would imagine Francis to be and who he himself imagined himself to be. And that's okay. What makes Francis of Assisi and his conflicted self attractive to me is that he makes me think of myself as on the way to holiness and rather than being holy from the time you were born. And so he's not a saint that I cannot emulate. He's a saint that I feel comfortable hanging around because it tells me that even sainthood is a journey and not an event. So let me address the limitations of the series. First of all, I'm sticking to the man, the Saint Francis, right? I'm not dealing with the Franciscan order because that is a 6-week series will not be enough to understand that. Franciscans themselves understood Francis differently, and so there's a lot of conflict. And so I'm choosing not to get into, except to say that, how the order may have been founded. I'm not entering into any of the complexities and, the history of the Franciscan order. I'm not going to deal with Saint Clare, the woman counterpart of Francis, except to mention the origins of the poor Clares. This is a story format. These 6 sessions, I'm going to take you in these sessions from his birth, his youth, all the way to his death, except my last session in which I'm going to draw some very serious conclusions and implications of Francis's life for the contemporary church. But otherwise, you'll find that you are sitting and listening to a beautiful story, a story that has complexities and conflicts, yet it's a story. So that's the format I'm following. 5 sessions trying to understand his life. By the way, at the end of each session, you are going to be sent, if you've registered via email, something to reflect for the entire week. So you find that, okay, I'm trying to move the screen here, and it should move, but it's not. So that's where you can, if you haven't registered, that's either you can scan the QR code or you can go to that link, and that is where you can register. And if you register here with your email, the information I'm going to send to you is going to get to you, so you have material to reflect during the week, okay? So then, after this introduction, let's begin with a simple prayer that Francis prayed as he was kneeling in front of the crucifix in that little chapel, Saint Damiano or San Damiano. And perhaps we can even pray this together. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity. Give me perception and knowledge, Lord, that I might carry out your holy and true command. Amen. Simple prayer, but typical of Francis, is packed with meaning and implications. This prayer is contained in the material you will receive at the end of the session via email, so you can actually pray that during the week. So let's try to understand Francis. To understand Francis, we have to understand Europe of the time. We have to understand Assisi, this little city, and the social, the economic, political, and religious realities of the time. If we do not understand that, we cannot understand Francis. He's a man of his time. Like any of us, Francis was a product of the medieval times and medieval church, yet someone who defied it. Francis was born in a little town called Assisi, the population of which in Francis's time was about 2,000 to 3,000, not more than that. And compared to the bigger cities of the time, like Rome or Florence, it was not very significant, either militarily or politically. But it was impacted by the economic and political changes of the late 12th century. So Assisi, the word to use is a commune/city. Assisi is a commune, and is among other communes of the area. This is one of the communes, and they tried to liberate themselves from imperial control. So they're trying to be pretty much independent cities and outside the realm of, empires and the imperial powers. These communes or cities, they organized themselves. They had their own defenses, a little militia to fight off enemies, to protect them. And it almost reached the level of independence. Now, cities such as Assisi developed their own political and administrative structures, where leaders who administered these communes were elected. So basically, then what is happening is the administration is developing bottom up, then being imposed by an emperor or a king. Now, these Italian cities also attempted to conquer neighboring territories, so they wanted to become bigger, right? And these territories belonged to the feudal lords, who either of their own free will or by force had to subject themselves to one of these communes. So the communes were independent, but not the feudal lords who were important. Now, as the communes conquered more and more areas around them, guess what happens? At some points, they conflict with the other communes because territories are now beginning to border with each other. Now, in these communes, in these cities like Assisi, there were rich merchants and traders who had great influence. And they became the way in which culture and education would grow. Now, remember, there is no imperial existence, so what is happening? There is no nobility. And this lack of the nobility, like you would see them in France, right, had its own impact on these communes and on people like Francis and the family from which Francis came. Why? Because these were the people, the merchants, were the people who were responsible for any growth in culture and education. Education particularly because at least these merchants needed to know reading, writing, and math. Otherwise, they couldn't trade. Now, Assisi itself, let's talk about now Assisi. It's divided. The wealthy landowners who owned rural land often fought with merchant families. These were known as the popolo, P-O-P-O-L-O, whose wealth came from urban commerce. So you have two groups of people. And this was not a class conflict because both these people are rich. They're very wealthy. The merchants and the landowners. In 1197, there was a civil war in Assisi when the popolo rose against the landowners and expelled them. And many of the towers and their fortified dwellings were razed to the ground. They were destroyed. Now, Francis's father, Pietro de Bernardone, and his mother, Pica, they belonged to the popolo, which is the urban merchants. The family had a house, and their house was a valuable real estate. It was one of the top 3 houses in the locality. His family was not from the nobility. Pietro was a successful urban merchant, and historians tell us that most probably Pietro came, like many other people of the time, came to Assisi to make a fortune and ended up being very successful. Pietro died in 1215. Francis has said nothing about it. His mother, Pica, also belonged to the merchant family, and her family was very wealthy. She died in 1211, so about 4 years before Pietro died. Most probably, Pietro, the father, entered into a business relationship with the wealthy family of Pica, who owned a cloth trading business. And most probably Pietro learned trading from Pica's family. Now, Francis had a brother by the name of Angelo. And Pietro and Pica had other children, but unfortunately, we know nothing about these people. We are not certain of the actual date of Francis's birth. What we sure about is the date of his baptism. And that was March the 28th, 1182. In those days, the general practice was to baptize all the healthy babies at the Easter Vigil. So that's how we know the date of his baptism. But otherwise, we probably wouldn't even have known that. We know very little about his childhood and his youth, but being a boy and from a wealthy family, he probably was sent to school where he received basic education. By the way, he's not one of those very educated saints, right? He was dearly loved by his mother, and at school, he probably acquired a basic knowledge of Latin, sufficient enough to write simple records for business purposes, not the church Latin we think about, right? And at some point, he learned enough French to sing popular songs, serenading young ladies. But all through, his language remains very rudimentary. He's not one of those learned scholarly saints. Now, around 1195, he was approaching the age of 14. He began to work as an apprentice for his father. He learned to sell cloth, keep financial records, and control inventory. He was gifted, he had a keen mind, he was an intelligent guy, engaging personality, and made friends easily. And he mingled and spent time with the other well-to-do youth of his town. Now remember, there was no nobility, I said to you, right? But there were people in the absence of nobility who mimicked their lives and had fun with it. Francis would be one of them. What developed was fraternities of young people who kind of tried to live the life of the nobility. The rich played out this role of the nobility in these communes. Now, if the nobility were there, one way in which the nobility showed their class and their status was displaying love for young ladies in a very courtly manner. And this was central to the life of a young nobleman. They would splurge wealth, right? They would dress exquisitely. They would serenade women in public, sometimes going to their homes, and you've heard this in history and perhaps seen this in movies as well. And they showcased their excellence and their ability to entertain. They spent like crazy. Francis became a member of one such fraternity. Not only that, he actually became the leader of his fraternity. It was called Societas Iuvenum. So there were parades through the city. This is not the parade of the nobilities, but this is the parade of the wealthy merchants. They would parade through the city, and at parades, he would carry the baton of the office of the fraternity and lead the members of the fraternity in frivolity, in song, in lavish food, in frolic. He spent money on dinners and parties. He even learned the reputation of being prodigal. Now, his parents were concerned, but not enough, because even though he was leading this life, that's the life of any of the wealthy merchant kids of the time. He was one of the people who was at the center of, Assisi's young life, and his parents were concerned, but not too worried about it. Now, his personality at this time was, historians say, was vain, and to a certain extent, narcissistic. He would add patches of old and faded cloth to the fine silk and wool to create an outlandish effect. And you think of kids who have, or even young people and adults today who have patched jeans, right? This looks like the medieval patched fashion, where people would take old cloth and put it on and try to look outlandish. He could care less about what people thought about him as long as he was the center of attention. At the same time, there is no evidence that he was immoral or that he engaged in debauchery. Francis was no Augustine. There's no instances of him leading this. He was, call him a spoiled brat at the time, but he's no immoral guy. He's not involved in sexual sins or sins of the flesh. He was generous. He was courteous. He was a refined son of a well-to-do merchant who lived the life of the youth of the time. Francis was also very sensitive. There's a story of a poor beggar who dropped into his busy shop hoping for a handout. This is when he was living this life of fun and frolic. Not typical of Francis. For some reason, Francis dismisses this beggar, and he went back to work. But it bothered Francis. Bothered him enough that he ran after the man to make up for refusing him the help that he needed. He became contrite. He regretted the episode. He regretted the event, and swore to show kindness to everyone, regardless of the class. So this is Francis, while he was this guy who also would lead his fraternity in the ways that the society of the time demanded of him. But there was one prominent quality Francis had that would ultimately end up having a great impact on his conversion. Francis was averse to filth and ugliness, right? Smells, the sight of filth. And this is where I kind of connect with Francis, right? I tell people I could never be in the medical profession. It's not that I don't have compassion. It's like something in me revolts against the sight of that which is not pleasant. And he was averse to, Francis himself was. And this was the biggest struggle even before it became a spiritual struggle. He recognized it in himself. It is not that he did not care for the poor. He did. He was sensitive. But the sight of pain, suffering, physical deformity, it terrified him. I remember something from my own life when I was back in India. There was a guy who was on a scaffolding painting, and he did not have his belt on, and he fell down from the scaffolding, and he was lying on the ground, writhing in pain, and I'm the one who actually blacked out. I can't stand to think of pain. Something in my body doesn't click. When I have pain, I have very little pain tolerance. The moment I have pain, I black out. Francis's way was he simply avoided such situations, and he avoided such people. Now, the period of his apprenticeship with his father was a very turbulent one historically and politically, and now you will understand why I gave you the political and the social context of Assisi, because it's going to impact Francis in a very personal way. In March 1198, the popular government overthrew the imperial lordship and destroyed the towers and buildings that represented the urban nobility. This land-owning wealthy people were exiled to Perugia. And Assisi formed an alliance with the other communes and moved against Perugia. Francis's family supported the Assisi government, and Francis served in the militia of the communes, alongside the same young people who were part of the fraternity. Now, he was no ordinary militia. He was wealthy enough to own a horse, so he served as a mounted troop rather than a foot soldier. Now, the military move against Perugia that Assisi and the other communes carried out was disastrous. Assisi faced a bloody defeat. Francis and his companions were imprisoned for a year. Because he was a mounted militia, a horse-owning prisoner, he was imprisoned with what we might call the aristocracy. Biographers tell us that while in prison, he tried to keep the spirits of the fellow prisoners up. He would reconcile disputes among prisoners, and he would befriend those knights that others would not accept. See, sensitivity is there with those people who were the underdogs. But prison did not do Francis any good. Does to whom, for that matter, both physically and mentally. By the time he was released in 1203, his health took a beating, even though he was one of the better prisoners. The once extroverted, cheerful young man was beginning to turn inward and onto himself. Biographers would say that he was worn down by his illness. And this crisis that Francis went through lasted for 18 months. Folks, that's a year and a half. That's a long time. He began to wander aimlessly. He lost all interest in beauty, in nature, things that he loved before. But something else began to afflict him. We might call this PTSD today. In those days, perhaps there was no psychological term for this. But he was plagued by strange dreams. Dreams which related to flashbacks about the war. He would dream that his own house was piled high with weapons. This war-related flashback left him confused, unsure of himself. He couldn't understand what was going on. Francis began to experience bouts of self-hate and guilt. Now, in the spring of 1205, this is about 18 months later, Francis gave signs that he was beginning to emerge out of his psychological state. And he began to throw himself into preparation for another military venture. You see, at that point, the papacy was supporting the claim of Frederick II to the throne of Sicily. And Assisi supported the papacy. So they began to gather followers for yet another military adventure. Now, Francis was beginning to emerge out of his psychological state, but he was not all there. He was trying. So even though he was unsettled, even though he did not have the energy for it, he forced himself to join the militia. But as I said, he was not all there. He was erratic in his behavior. There's the story about, he was one of those people who, to get ready for this new battle, had a horse, he bought weapons, and even bought the finery that these mounted soldiers would wear when they went into battle. He bought it, he was getting ready, but he turned around and gave it all away, including the horse. He gave away to another knight who could not afford it. But then he went and got a new horse, more weapons, finery, and even an attendant to take care of the horse, perhaps. And then he reported for duty. So even though he's trying to come out of his funk, he's struggling. His behavior tells us so. Now he had a dream that night that it gives indication that a conversion may have been in store, although he himself does not, at that point recognize it as a spiritual intervention. Francis had a dream where he heard his name being called. And he found himself ushered into a splendid palace of a beautiful bride. It was filled with shining shields and other arms, and he was dumbfounded in the dream. And he inquired about who the master of the place was and who owned everything that was in this beautiful palace. And the answer that he heard was that the master of this palace was Francis. Now, it could be that this dream is associated with his gifting of his horse and everything else to this poor knight and then getting it. But Francis began to see himself in this dream as the one who was desirous of glory with all its splendor. So he's yearning for something, and yet he's not there. He's struggling with other movements going on in his life. Historians say that this could be the first instance of a divine intervention in his life. So, when Francis got to about 30 miles from Assisi, heading towards this new military adventure in a place called Spoleto, he began to experience anxiety about this new venture. He seemed to have shared with his companions that military expedition was not the formula for glory. That night, whatever was going on in his mind, he abandoned his plan. He realized that the return to the military, which he was forcing himself to be engaged in, was not the solution to his problem. He heads back to Assisi. So in one sense, he becomes a deserter. 18 miles on the way back to Assisi, 18 miles away from Assisi, he did something that would alter his life forever. He sold his finery and his arms. He sold even his horse and put on a regular set of clothes. He then walked to Assisi. And at the outskirts of that city, he arrived that evening. He was totally adrift. Everything that he knew about himself and everything that he wanted to do just smoothed away from under his feet. 2 miles outside of Assisi, he came to an old rundown church, the church of San Damiano. This church actually goes back to 1030, so it's a few hundred years old. But because of how old it was, had also fallen into a state of disrepair. Now, being located outside the walls of the city, there was not enough congregation to keep it up, right? It's one of those buildings that happens to the inner city churches these days. In those days, to the cities on the outside of the city. Francis found the priest, Don Peter, and that night he sought the permission of the parish priest to stay there. The priest agreed. Francis, he had money in his hands because he had just sold his horse and his finery and his arms, and he asked the priest to hold the money for him from the sale But the priest refused. See, everybody knew Francis because he came from a very wealthy family, right? He did not want to be liable for money that belonged to a local prodigal youth. I wouldn't do that, right? So Francis let the money on the window ledge, and actually he forgets about it. The next morning when he left, he did not even take that money with him. He went back to his family and he tried to pick up the pieces of his now fragmented life. Now, shortly after his return to Assisi, some friends came and elected him to preside at one of those parades, one of those dinners, one of those moments when they would engage in fun and frolic, parading through the city. And of course, they called him because they wanted him to pay for it too. Francis went along with the plans, but he was quiet. He was moody. After dinner, they paraded through the streets in the usual way, but Francis fell behind. One of his friends realized that Francis was lost. They couldn't find him. And he went back. And he found Francis standing alone, quiet, self-absorbed, emotionally numb. This was not the Francis that these young people were used to. Francis also began to lose interest in the family business. He stopped going to work. He withdrew even more and more and remained in his bedroom. Now, his actions at this time probably give us some indication into what is going on inside. We would maybe call it, chronic depression. What did people do in those days when they were afflicted like this? The medieval church had things that they would do. Now, by the way, besides the history of the medieval political and social structure, I should have given you a little context into the medieval church and the spirituality of the time. For lack of time, I'm not doing that, but in the material that I'm going to send to you, the first part basically describes the medieval church and the medieval piety. Okay, so you get to see an idea of where all this stands. So typical of the medieval times, in the traditional medieval times, Francis begins to engage in medieval acts of piety. Penance, almsgiving, prayer, and bodily mortification. Somehow he's trying to liberate himself from the state that he's in. And the only thing that he could turn to is the medieval piety. Almsgiving, prayer, bodily mortification, fasting. We are in Lent, and on Ash Wednesday, we just heard Jesus say to us, these are the 3 acts of piety that we practice. And medieval church practiced it not only during Lent, but throughout the year. And so here you have Francis having recourse to these medieval acts of piety. So during these times, whenever he went out of the house, Francis began to give alms to any beggar who asked. And when he ran out of money, when he had nothing to give, he would literally give the shirt of his back to anybody who asked. He secretly purchased furnishings for poor churches and began to deliver them to the priest in charge. Again, medieval act of piety, trying to keep the churches going. Biographers tell us that in doing so, he was somehow trying to find favor with God. Now, as is the case with most reformers, conversion happens to the person, right? But the social structure around the reformer or the person who is going through this conversion remains the same. And this is where conflict begins to emerge. So he's experiencing something. Hey, but the world is going on. Medieval society could not make Francis's struggles or his decision easy because the institutional structures were simply too rigid. Now, Francis's behavior began to trouble his father. Now, his father could put up with his prodigality, if that is a word. He could put up with all his fun and frolic and all the nonsense with the young people. He could understand. That was, errant behavior. But what he was seeing in his son now was not that. This was some form of a compulsive behavior that Francis was showing. This is not just about being prodigal. So his father, Pietro, began to scold his son, ordered him back to work. Francis refused. When his father was gone and Francis was alone at meals with his mother, he would pile his plate high with food. He would take the food that he would not eat, actually he was deliberately doing that, and he would go and give it to the beggars. His mother was not too happy about this, but here is a mother who's trying to get her son to find peace. So she just went along with him, but he did this when his father was not there. This was a rather odd behavior that his mother was noticing, but she had to go along with it. Now again, part of the medieval spirituality, he's struggling, and to help himself, he makes a pilgrimage to Rome. So he's a penitent, he's doing almsgiving, he's engaged in prayer, he's doing mortification, but then he does those ultimate things. He takes a pilgrimage. And he went to the tomb of St. Peter. At the tomb, of course there's a grill, so he could not, he's looking for anything to cling on to. We don't know too much of what happened there, but we know that he threw handfuls of coins through the grill before the altar of the shrine of St. Peter, the tomb of St. Peter. Now, biographers tell us that while he was leaving the church, he exchanged his clothing with a beggar. And that he himself became a beggar. He began to beg from the other people who were passing by. Now, the news of this did not reach his father, and you could have imagined whatever happened if it did reach his father. But Francis was drifting into madness. Whatever was happening to him was sheer insanity. When he returned from Rome, again, medieval ways of dealing with issues, he sought the counsel of the bishop. The bishop's name is Guido II, Guido. Now, the bishop knew Francis because he was a veteran, and Francis belonged to a rather notable family in Assisi. The bishop listened to Francis reluctantly, but hey, this is an influential guy, let me just give him some time. And he was patient with Francis. We do not know what happened there, but after the conversation, Francis's desire for solitude and prayer and self-mortification only increased. He lost all his friends, except one. Unfortunately, the name of this friend has not been recorded, so we don't know who this friend was. This friend would roam around with Francis in the woods, in the neighboring woods. Sometimes Francis would leave this guy outside the cave near Assisi while he spent hours inside, and the friend would just wait for him. Now, on his return from the forest, one day, he stopped to pray at the church of San Damiano one more time. And before the altar, he begged God to reveal God's will. He prayed, and that's the prayer we prayed at the beginning of our session. He prayed, "Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart." See how it makes sense now, that prayer? He is in darkness. Enlighten the darkness of my heart, and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity. Give me perception and knowledge, Lord, that I might carry out your holy and true command. As he prayed, he heard, "Do you not see, Francis, that my house is crumbling? Go then and repair it for me." Now, this was Francis's first mystical experience. Francis took these words literally, and even till the end, Francis believed that the voice that he heard was not his imagination, that was real. So Francis understood these words in a very literal way, and he began to build the dilapidated St. Damiano Chapel. Francis found relief in this. You know, he's any straw that he could hold on to, he's holding on to. And in this prayer before the crucifix, he finds great relief. And he began to return there more frequently. And what he would do is give the priest, Don Peter, money to pay for the oil to light a lamp before the crucifix above the altar where he prayed. Now, while he is praying in front of the crucifix, this crucifix and his prayer before the crucifix begins to have a tremendous amount of impact on him. It had a profound impact on him. He would cry uncontrollably. See, for the first time, he began to be churned inward with the passion of Jesus Christ. And listen, I'm going to say something to you right now. You know, we say that Francis is about nature and the environment and about peace. But if we do not understand Francis's relationship with the passion of Jesus Christ, you miss Francis completely. Completely. His reflection on the passion and the suffering of Jesus crucified, is the singular most life-changing impact on his life. And we are in Lent, so that's another reason why I chose Francis of Assisi during Lent, because it's going to talk to us, and he's going to talk to us a lot. So he begins to identify himself with the passion of Jesus Christ. And what that does is connects his works of penance even more intricately. Now he has a reason to do penance, not because he's just doing it for his own sake, but he finds unity and union with the passion of Jesus Christ. He began to mortify his body with harsh bodily penances. Now, whether we agree with that or not is a different question. This is medieval piety. We may be moved by the passion of Jesus Christ and the crucifix, but we don't harm ourselves in a way that we would consider it harmful, but in those days it's an act of penance. So he begins in his finding this union with the passion of Jesus and suffering of Jesus Christ. He begins to undergo deep amounts of physical penance. So this is where we are going to pause for this very first session. Next Friday when we come together, we're going to continue the story from here and take his struggle, his internal struggle, and his spiritual struggle further. It will lead Francis away from his home, away from society, to, quite unawares, becoming part, slowly, unintentionally, of a group of friends who would then finally become the beginning of what we call the Franciscan order. And we will move in that direction in the coming week. As soon as the session is over, there is an email that's going out to you. It's about a page and a half. And let me explain to you what you probably could do with it. So I have, for the first part, given you a brief, very brief. You can research more. This is what the whole week is for. Research more about the medieval church. But I have given you the context for the medieval church in that time. Few things that have happened. There has been a schism in the church between the Eastern and the Western churches, right? The life of the clergy is not very exemplary. There's a tremendous amount of corruption. Lay people are trying to follow the gospel really seriously, and there were many movements that developed where people were simply on their own trying to live the gospel-centered life. In this context, because these are lay people, these people haven't had theological education, or any amount of heresies emerged. Now, the heretics were seen as people who were trying to live the gospel life as opposed to the clergy and the hierarchy. And so a lot of movements emerged. Some of them were approved by Rome and some were not. This is the context in which Francis also begins his own personal movement. So you will get familiar with the medieval church, do some research, try to find out. I'm not giving you sources, but I'm giving you the context, and you can take it and go with it wherever you want. What I want to say is that Francis of his time breaks few barriers. Be aware of those as you read more or reflect more. Francis, in his life before his conversion, becomes a kind of a knight and a courtier and a nobleman, even though he was a merchant. So he's used to this guy who's breaking barriers, right? Second, as a lay person, he gave himself over to a life of penance, something that the monks did. The monastics are the ones who practiced that. Lay people did not as much. So he gives himself to a life of penance without being a priest or an ordained person. He also overturned the strict division of orders. So he is a merchant. There are merchants, there are warriors, there are peasants, there are laborers, there are penitents, there are the ordained. In some way, Francis was all of these and yet more. So you can't put him in a neat box over there. He's been all of these things. He's breaking constantly barriers. But his greatest contribution was even a higher goal: to recover by means of an immediate return to the gospel example of Jesus Christ. And I want you to keep this at the back of your minds. I have often preached about this. Pope Francis talks about this a lot. Listen, the church is in a moment of a crisis right now. And I think for the past 12, 15 years, as I've been part of the parish communities here, I've constantly said that the church has to get back to the gospel. Francis teaches us that. And this is Francis's contribution to the contemporary church, just in this first session. I think our faith and our Catholicism and how we imagine church and Christianity gets polluted by too many realities. First of all, I mean, like in those days, the clergy, with all the child abuse crisis, has not offered much to the church, right? But then there's also the influence of our politics. I cannot talk enough about this. We do not look at the gospel from the lens of the gospel. And instead of looking at our society from the lens of the gospel, we are looking at the gospel from the lens of our political leanings. And it's just disastrous. I've been saying this, the more I say it, the more enemies I make. Francis teaches us to return to the church of the Gospels. So there's plenty of reflection on that. The rest is, I have points for you to take and reflect for the rest of the week. So you can take and do what you want with these statements and the points that I offer. And of course, I also send you that prayer of Francis. Most high, glorious God, enlighten the darkness of my heart and give me true faith, certain hope, and perfect charity. Give me perception and knowledge, Lord, that I might carry out your holy word and true command. Amen. Good night and God bless. See you next Friday here at 6:30 in the evening. You're welcome. Listen, we'll have time for some questions next week.